Here we are again, students of Theory 101. This is Professor Seth Monahan with our fourth online lesson. This week, our topic is second and third species harmonic counterpoint. Here's how the lesson looks. It's fairly simple this week. We start with second species, we move into third species, and then we go straight into a composition workshop where you can follow me doing a third species exercise from start to finish. So we're going to begin with second species, but first I want to take stock of some things that are going to carry over from first species into second and third species. It's the nature of species exercises that things you learn in first species will still apply in second, so let's review the things that you already know about second species. The way the thing works in general is the same. The teacher gives a student a baseline with Roman numerals, and the student composes a melody. The baseline that the teacher gives will usually end with some kind of cadence that's specified, and the student will have to write a melody that accommodates that particular type of cadence. The last bar in second and third species, just like in first species, is a whole note. The same rules of motion apply that we learned in first species. This has to do with, for instance, no parallel perfect fifths and octaves, no similar motion from a diminished fifth into a perfect fifth, those things. And finally, our preference rules about the acoustic qualities of counterpoints will carry over from first species. So here we're going to prefer, once again, dissonances and imperfect consonances to those empty or hollow-sounding perfect consonances. And while the rhythm of your counterpoint will change in second species, what's convenient is that the rhythm in second and third species is the same. So whereas in first species you had only whole notes, in second species and third species, every bar is going to contain either two half notes or a half and two quarters. And then second and third species are each distinguished because they each introduce a new technique for dealing with non-chord tones. Recall that in first species there were no non-chord tones. Every tone you wrote was a member of the chord underneath. Let's start by looking at an actual example. Here is a baseline that's very similar to the one that started our lesson last week, but here's a second species counterpoint written over it, and you can see immediately some things are different. The rhythm again is different, and then now there are these red notes labeled with P's that we'll want to talk about in a moment. So what do the P's indicate? The P's indicate what are called passing tones. And what would be so special about these passing tones that I would make them red and circle their integers? Well, they're non-chord tones. None of these so-called passing tones is part of the chord underneath. You can see this, for instance, in the first bar. We're in this key of C. There's a root position tonic chord. As you know, the tones of the chord are C, E, and G. But there, in the middle of the bar, is a D, which, as you can hear, is not part of the chord. And it's by virtue of its being a passing tone that we can use that. It's important to mention that in second species, passing tones are the only type of non-chord tone you can use. One of the premises of species counterpoint is that we're really controlling how we introduce non-harmonic tones. The passing tone is our only option at this stage. Do note, however, that when chord tones are concerned, you can use them with total freedom. Just to give you an example, here's the second, third, and fourth bars of this particular exercise are all chord tones, and I'm able to leap kind of freely into them and out of them. I can shape the line nicely, but there's no restrictions on how I can use chord tones. Passing tones, there are restrictions, so let's take a moment to really examine what a passing tone is and how it's used. So what is a passing tone? As you know, a passing tone is a non-chord tone, and what it does is connect two chord tones that lie a third apart. And how it does this is by moving by step from one to the other. So you have two stable chord tones that are a third apart, and you're going to connect them with a line that moves in a single direction from one to the next, in and out by step. What this means is that there is no leaping involved with passing tones. If you can't leap into a passing tone, if so, it's not a passing tone. You can't leap out of one, because if you do that, it's not a passing tone. The whole nature of passing tones is that there's a single stepwise motion in one direction, in and out by step. In real music, they can occur on any beat. In species counterpoint, they're only going to occur on beats 3 or 4 in second species. And there are 3 different rhythmic options. And we're going to go over these now. The first is to have a half note passing tone on beat 3 of the bar. So here is a pair of chord tones. I have a tonic chord with a third above it, we go to a 6 chord that has a third above that. Those are both chord tones. We can check that by looking at the unabbreviated bass figures. Both of these are 5/3 chords, and just to confirm, there is a 3 in each 5/3 signature, so we're on very solid ground, both chord tones, and I hope you'd be able to see that we can connect these with a passing tone on D natural, moving by step from E to D to C. And let's hear it. And we can confirm that that passing tone is not part of the underlying chord by looking at the interval. We have a C in the bass up to a D in the melody, and sure enough, that 2 from C to D is not part of the unabbreviated bass signature. Hopefully by now we're getting to the point where you could simply tell that D is not part of a C major chord and be confident with that assessment. The next rhythmic option is to have a quarter note on beat 3 of the bar. So here we're going to move from tonic to a 4 chord, and within the span of tonic, we're going to go from a chordal E to a chordal G, and there's our passing F that connects them by step. And we can see that the interval is a 4th above the bass, and of course a 4 is not part of a 5/3 chord. We can tell it's non-chordal. This is done correctly, move in and out by step, and then we could continue, for instance, by step to a 3rd above the next bass note. Our final rhythmic option is to have a passing tone on the quarter note on beat 4 rather than beat 3. So here we're going to go from a tonic chord to a 5/6 chord. We're going to start on G, and we're going to end on G. And within the tonic chord, we're going to leap down from a chordal 5th to a chordal 3rd. And I hope you can see that from that E up to the next G, we can add a passing F. Whose interval is, once again, a 4th above the bass. It's that same non-chordal F that we saw in the previous example. So these are the 3 rhythmic options, and it's important to note that they are different in certain regards. Notice the middle one here. The passing note occurs entirely within the bar. The first chord tone, the second chord tone, and the passing tone that connects them are all occurring within one harmony. By contrast, the first and third rhythms I show you here have passing tones that pass across the bar line, so that the first chord tone and the second chord tone are actually not part of the same chord. In the first one here, we move from a chordal E in the C chord to a chordal C in the A minor chord. Same thing with moving from the chordal E over the tonic to the G over the dominant. Okay? So passing tones can either pass across the bar line from one chord to another, or pass within the bar if you have the quarter note on beat 3. And the question of when to use passing tones is really one of taste and nuance. You can use them often, and I think you should use them often. They give melodies a very dynamic quality, a very purposeful, stepwise motion, but you don't have to always use them. There can be bars, even several bars in a row, where you don't use them. The point is to always be musical. So there's a couple special considerations. With rhythm, the bass lines I give you may occasionally move in half notes instead of whole notes. So when this happens, use a passing tone only on the 4th quarter note of the bar, or not at all. We have to now consider something I'm calling downbeat parallels. Just as we have to avoid parallel perfect fifths and octaves in counterpoint in general, we also want to avoid consecutive perfect fifths and octaves on consecutive downbeats. Now, I'm going to give you an example here. Let me play this, and I'm going to stress these downbeats, and I hope you can hear the peculiar sound of it. In general, there are just too many perfect intervals in that. But also notice the strange effect that just by the nature of being downbeats, there's a kind of added emphasis to the first part of each bar. And the ear really notices not only that there's this density of perfect intervals, but also that every single downbeat here has a perfect octave on it. And that there's a kind of subliminal effect of parallel octaves, even though there aren't really parallel octaves. It's kind of an aural illusion. But what you need to do is avoid having octaves or fifths on consecutive downbeats, because it really just sounds bad. And I'll play this example one more time. Icky. Now, with regard to leaps, it's the nature of second species exercises that they're going to contain more notes than a first species exercise. And that in turn gives you more to think about when it comes to shaping your line, when it comes to building a contour, when it comes to balancing stepwise motion with leaps. As a rule of thumb, you want a good mixture of stepwise motion and leaps. Any of your passing tones are naturally going to be by step. Other motions by step are excellent. Small leaps you can use more or less without limit. Leaps of a third or a fourth. Be careful with larger leaps. You want to use those less frequently. A leap of a sixth or a seventh or an octave should occur probably only once in an exercise. You should never leap more than an octave. One good rule of thumb is that after a big leap, say after leaping a fifth or a sixth, it's really a good idea to change direction and move in the other direction. So if you leap, for instance, a minor sixth, rather than continuing to go up, it's good to change direction and move by step to kind of balance out the leap. Another special consideration pertains to your opening bar. It's your choice in the opening bar to use either two half notes or a half rest followed by a single half note. The idea here being that by starting one voice slightly after the other, you increase their independence, the impression that they're both distinct contrapuntal lines. And then finally, there's no repeated notes in this species. In the first species, you were able to repeat a note, say, one time, maybe twice, tastefully. Here, we're not going to repeat notes at all, because there's usually some more dynamic, more lyrical option than to simply repeat a note several times in a row. So let's move on to third species now, which is actually very similar to second species. Part of the reason I can do these in a single lecture is because they're closely related. Like second species, third species uses only two rhythms, two halves or a half and two quarters. The same issues apply with regard to, say, downbeat parallels. Don't have consecutive bars that have perfect fifths or perfect octaves on the downbeats. The same issues with regard to leaps. If you leap more than, say, a fifth, change direction and move by step to balance it out. Also, we can't repeat notes in this species, just like second species. And now we add a new non-chord tone. You're going to be able to use passing tones in third species, but now we're adding what's called a neighbor tone. Neighbor tones are, like passing tones, non-chord tones. The difference being, whereas a passing tone connected two chord tones that were a third apart, a neighbor tone embellishes a single chord tone, which is repeated. And it does this with a kind of away and back again gesture. So once again, like passing tones, we're moving only by step, but rather than moving by step continuously in one direction, we move away from the embellished note and then back to it. So down then up, or up then down. And like second species, our neighbor tones are going to only fall on beats 3 and 4. And like second species, there's 3 rhythmic options, and these are actually the same rhythmic options. We can have a beat 3 half note. Here we go from an octave on the tonic chord to a third above the submediant. And we can take that C, which is a stable chord tone in both cases, and embellish it with a neighbor note. We could, for instance, go up to a D, creating a non-chordal second above the bass, and then back again. And there's our away and back again motion you can see with the angled arrow here. We start on a chord tone, go up, and then back down again. And your neighbors can be above or below the embellished note. Our second option is to have a neighbor note on the third quarter note of the bar, on beat 3. So here we're going from a 1 chord to a 4/6 chord. And the beat 3 neighbor note is going to embellish 2 chord tones which are part of the same chord. So here are 2 E's above the tonic chord. And we could go to, say, a lower neighbor, a D, which creates a second above the bass, and then go back up again. So there's the away and back again gesture. And then it's nice to continue by step across the bar line. Finally, the third rhythmic option is to have a quarter note on beat 4, just like second species. And that would work like this. Here we're going, again, from a tonic to an inverted dominant chord. Over the tonic chord, we have a chordal third and a chordal fifth. And then that G natural carries over to the next bar that has the dominant chord in it, and we can use a neighbor tone to embellish that G. Here I'm going to use a lower neighbor, which produces a fourth above the bass. And it sounds like this. We could also have used an upper neighbor again. I haven't shown that here. That's an upper neighbor embellishment to the G. Both are totally acceptable. And I want to stress again that with these rhythmic options, only one has the embellishment falling entirely within a single bar. So only with the second option are we departing from and returning to a chord tone that is part of the same chord. In the other two examples, we're moving back and forth to the same chord tone. In the first one it's C, in the second one it's G, but notice that that chord tone belongs to a different harmony by the time we get back to it. So in the first one, we start on C as part of the one chord, but by the time we get back to C, it's a chord tone within another chord. It's a subtle point, but it's one worth remembering. So with all that in mind, let's move now into Sibelius, where we can work on a third species example, which will give us a chance to see both passing and neighbor tones in action, while also giving me a chance to offer some advice on how to work through one of these larger, more complicated species exercises. All right, here is a bass line in the key of D major, and I'll play the bass line first by itself, and then with some chords. And you'll notice that I've already filled in the boxes above and below the staff so that we now know our available chord tones in each bar and also our unabbreviated bass signatures to double check our intervals between the staves. So here we're faced with 8 empty bars. My recommendation would be to actually start with the last bar. Notice that the example specifies an incomplete authentic cadence. We end on a tonic chord, and that our preferred note in that bar is going to be an F sharp, a third above the bass. So we've just knocked down one bar entirely, and that should be psychologically comforting, if nothing else. Let's look at the beginning of the example now. We start on tonic, and given that it's always a good idea to have a contour that moves upward and then downward, we might want to consider starting on the same note here, beginning on that same F sharp. But then what comes next? Now, when working in second and third species, it's a really good idea to plan where you're going to end up on the next downbeat first before you fill in the second half of the bar. That is to say, rather than wondering about whether or not we're going to use a half note or 2 quarter notes and whether or not we're going to try to use a passing tone or a neighbor tone, let's decide where we want to end up on the downbeat of the second bar. And then that'll narrow our options. So looking here, we have A, C sharp, and E. Going down to E is going to probably lead us in the wrong direction. C sharp's a little distant. It may be that A here, the 6 above the bass, is probably our best option. So now, as you can immediately see, the second half of bar 1 becomes much clearer. If we wanted to here, the non-chord tone that seems most obvious would be a passing note on G. So we could start like this. Now, what if we wanted to use a neighbor note? Well, we can't use a half note neighbor note here, but we could certainly use a quarter note neighbor and end up going back to the note we started on. So rather than But I have to say, I like that less. Moving away and then back to the F sharp gives the sense that we're just embroidering the F sharp without really engaging in any purposeful motion. Whereas when we went from F sharp to G to A, there was this decisive stepwise gesture that sounded much more dynamic, much more musical. But I do like these two quarter notes in the bar. So what if we wanted to keep that quarter note motion, but use that same passing tone? One option would be to avail ourselves of the half rest that we can use in the first bar and in the first bar only. So suppose we were to actually just take this out and start on the F sharp and then go up to the G in the second half of the bar. It would sound like this. And I think I like that best of all so far. So now we've done that, and we could continue to work in this way from the beginning to the end, always plotting to the next downbeat. But it actually is a good idea to sketch out some of your downbeats, or maybe all of your downbeats, in advance to give you a kind of scaffolding to work with. This is going to help you determine the main gestalt of your contour. I'm thinking that it would be good to get to D by the downbeat of the next bar. That's not too far. We should be able to pull that off. Just a third. And that we could repeat that D on the downbeat of the next bar. And then around here, we could use our highest note. It won't be these Ds because we keep repeating it, but we can move above those Ds, for instance. And that from this D, we're going to want to try to start pulling downward towards our cadence. So perhaps have a B on this downbeat, and maybe an A on this downbeat, and an A on that downbeat. And I got to fill in my intervals here. And that downbeat is an octave, and I'm not crazy about that, but we'll see what we can do. So, now I've plotted in these downbeats, and they sound like this. And I'm looking at that last bar, and I can see here that it might be easy to just throw in a G passing tone to save us the trouble of working on that later. So our last bar could be... It certainly works nicely. So let's go back to the beginning of the exercise now. Second bar, we need to get from A up to D. That's always a good idea to ask yourself, can I connect these two downbeats by step? In second and third species, all your downbeats are going to be chord tones. Remember that your non-chord tones only fall in the second half of the bar. And in this case, we can link these by step if we want. We would need to use quarter notes, and we'd need to move from a non-chordal B above the bass to a octave above the bass. And it sounds like this. Now, I like that very much, but sharp-eyed viewers might note a potential problem here. Notice that in the bar 2, we have a 5-6 chord. In the 5-6 chord, the chordal third, the leading tone of the key, is in the bass. Now, as you know, you're not supposed to double your leading tone, and I've done exactly that here on the last beat of the bar. I got C sharp above C sharp. But this is a particular idiom you're going to come upon later in your harmony studies, where the leading tone of the key is not acting as a leading tone. Notice that this leading tone in the bass doesn't go up, it goes down. That means that in this particular example, we're okay to double the C sharp, and in fact, it has a very lovely sound. So here we are on what is so far the highest note of the exercise, and it repeats in the next bar. Maybe we should ask ourselves, can we push to our climax between those two Ds? And one really easy way to do that would be, since they're the same note, would be to embellish them with an E. Let's hear how that sounds. Certainly works. Suppose we wanted to continue that quarter note motion, though. What could we do there? Well, what we can't do is turn the E into a quarter note and then go back down to that D, because that would be a repeated note. And it actually doesn't sound very good. I don't really like that. However, if we leap up to a chordal F sharp that's in the chord, then we can make this a passing tone and lead down into the D. That definitely works. but I actually don't like it as much. So I'm going to do some Command Z here and go back to the half note E that I think did work very well. So now going from bar 4 to bar 5, we're faced here again with two notes separated by third, and what's always an option here is to use a half note passing tone. So I can fill in that C sharp, and we can do this. Now that's nice, but one thing that concerns me here is that we haven't leapt at all. That's a lot of stepwise motion. It's starting to sound like we're practicing scales and not writing a melody. So around this bar, bar 4, it seems to me we need to break that up with some kind of leap. I like the idea of leaping down to a chordal A here. That's a third above the bass. That breaks up the leaps very nicely from the beginning. I think that's much improved. So now, with the last two bars we have to fill in, we have the challenge of filling in this space where we're not actually descending very far. Notice that it's just a step from the downbeat of bar 5 on B to the downbeat of bar 6, which is an A. So a passing note in this fifth bar is not an option. One thing we could do is use a neighbor note. Try to use a lower neighbor here, taking us to a second above the bass and back to a third. So from the third bar, not nuts about that though, because it gives us this little wiggly thing where we're just going back and forth between A and B over and over again. It seems to me that if we're going to use a neighbor tone here, maybe going up to C sharp might be more effective. Because notice now we're plugging in that C sharp that we had skipped in bar 4. I like that. So now we have to deal with the second to last and third to last bars. We have a half a bar left, and we're getting from A on the downbeat of bar 6 to A on the downbeat of bar 7. The most obvious thing we can do is go up to a neighbor note on B. But again, I wonder that this is going to kind of give us a wiggly, meandering, kind of pointless sounding line by just going back and forth between A and B too often. Let's see how this sounds. From bar 5. That's okay, but it actually really kind of stinks. This might be another good place to break up the line with a leap. Again, there's so much stepwise motion here. We've only had one leap in 6 bars so far. Maybe we could leap down to the tonic of the chord. We could leap down to a sixth above the bass. Now from bar 6 we have... I like that in principle. The problem is we're moving in similar motion and leaping across that bar line into that octave. It just doesn't sound right. What if, instead of the A, we leap into a dissonant seventh, which is part of the chord, and maybe move that down to the fifth, so we're approaching that final scale degree 3 from above and below. This might work. That's pretty nice. We might consider decorating that last bar a little bit more, leading into the cadence by having a passing tone between the 7 and 5 in the chord. Let's hear how that sounds from bar 6. I like that very much. So just to summarize our uses of non-chord tones here, we have there's a passing tone. Here's another passing tone. Here is a neighbor tone. In this bar, we didn't use any non-chord tones. Here we went back to another neighbor. In this bar, we used only chord tones. And then here in the second to last bar, we used a passing tone. And we came up with something fairly nice. So to sum up, first of all, begin by plugging in your cadence note. It's a whole note rather than a half note. It's going to fill a full bar, and it's going to give you one less bar to work on. Second, consider your rhythmic options in the opening bar. Remember that you can use a half rest rather than a half note on the downbeat of the first bar. Most importantly, plot from downbeat to downbeat. Always be looking ahead to where you want to end up at the next bar line. It'll make choosing among your numerous options much easier. And finally, be flexible, be musical. Don't be satisfied with a solution that breaks no rules but which is otherwise mediocre. As you've seen here, it's possible to take just a few minutes and turn something fairly bland into something pretty satisfying. Species counterpoint too easily becomes a kind of connect the dots or Sudoku exercise if you don't engage it with your full musicianship. But you're going to get more out of these exercises and more out of species counterpoint in general by making it musical and by striving for excellence. So that is our third species composition workshop and the end of this lesson. Tune in next week for lesson 5, which deals with fourth species harmonic counterpoint.